Moscow sky, the morning of October 8, 1996, began with the familiar hum of aircraft engines. But among the dozens of planes that left the airfields of the capital, one stood out especially. It was the An-124 Ruslan, a giant of Soviet aviation engineering, the pride of the Antonov Design Bureau and one of the largest transport aircraft on the planet. When he took to the air, the audience on the ground always froze. Its size was amazing. The fuselage was longer than a 13-story building, and the height with the tail was like that of a 7-story building. The wheels of the chassis are 4 pieces, each the size of a car wheel, and they all work synchronously when this car touches the ground. For the military, he was a workhorse capable of transporting a tank or helicopter thousands of kilometers away. For civilian purposes, the Ruslan became a symbol of superpowers. It was on such aircraft that equipment was transported that could not fit into any other aircraft in the world. Even the Western partners, accustomed to Boeing and Airbus, looked at him with respect and slight envy. But greatness always goes hand in hand with vulnerability. The larger the structure, the higher the requirements for the accuracy of its operation. A huge mass does not forgive miscalculations. If for a light liner an error of a few seconds can be corrected, then for a heavy An-124 this sometimes means the point of no return. In such cases, engineering power becomes a burden. The aircraft simply does not have time to react as quickly as the pilots would like. Autumn in the Moscow region often brings dampness, low clouds, and morning fog. Kilovsky Airport, from where the flight took off, greeted the giant with cool air and a wet strip. It seemed nothing unusual. Crews all over the world are coping with much worse conditions every day. But it is on this day that a set of minor factors will begin to form a chain. And while the viewer sees a picture of the mighty Ruslan confidently rising into the sky, a voiceover hints, this flight will not reach its destination. It will combine error and confidence, the human factor and technical features, and the discrepancy between information and reality. All this will not turn out to be a demonstration of the power of aviation, but a reminder of how fragile even the most reliable machine can be. Those who watched the plane go at that moment could only admire its grandeur. No one knew that the Ruslan, which soared into the Moscow sky, would never return. This flight immediately stood out from the general list of tasks. The Aeroflot An-124 with the number 9981 was preparing to fly on the route Moscow, Turin, Bandar Seri Begavan. The final point of the route was far away in exotic Brunei, but the symbol of this flight was not so much the geography as the cargo. In Turin, Ruslan was supposed to pick up several Ferrari cars. Red sports cars, the epitome of speed and the Italian passion for technology, were supposed to fly across the oceans inside the steel belly of the Soviet giant. The contrast was almost cinematic. One aircraft was the size of a small block, designed to transport tanks and space modules. The other was a symbol of lightness, speed, and grace. Ruslan flew empty to Turin. For such a machine, this meant a huge reserve of power. The empty An-124 is capable of faster acceleration, it has a shorter takeoff distance, and the engines operate with less load. The crew could count on a quiet flight before the plane turned into a flying garage for Ferrari in Italy. There were 10 crew members on board, but there was an unusual situation in the cockpit. 2 commanders. According to the documents, Alexander Ugryamov was considered the main one. However, the actual control was carried out by Alexei Borodai, an experienced pilot who is well acquainted with international flights and complex routes. He sat in the commander's left-hand chair, while Ugryamov, the official one, played a more administrative role. Such duality might seem like a formality, but it will play its role at a critical moment. The takeoff from Kilovsky was flawless. The roar of 4 D-18Ts filled the morning air. The heavy aircraft smoothly lifted off the runway and, as if contradicting its own weight, confidently began to climb. From the outside, it looked like simple power, but inside the cockpit, the pilots felt their usual responsibility. During the first hours of the flight, everything went smoothly. At an altitude of several kilometers, life in the cockpit flowed smoothly. Regular radio communications with dispatchers, monitoring of system parameters, discussions about the upcoming approach in Turin. It seemed like it would be one of those flights that you wouldn't even remember about later, just another item in the flight book. But behind the calmness, there was information that was already starting to work against the crew. Repairs were underway at Turin Airport. The runway, which normally had a length of 3,300 meters, was shortened by almost a kilometer. The end of the runway was moved forward by 950 meters, leaving the pilots less room to maneuver. This was not a serious problem for light airliners, but for such a giant as the An-124, every meter played a role. The dispatching service warned the crews about the repair work, but there were inaccuracies in the wording and in the documents. According to the papers, the crew was notified that the runway had been shortened by 1,300 meters. But in reality, the working part remained only 2,350 meters away. To the viewer, this number may seem abstract, but pilots know that for an aircraft the size of the An-124, this is an extremely important factor. The giant needs hundreds of meters just for its powerful braking systems to start confidently slowing down the wheels, and the thrust reversal to open its doors. An error in calculations means that instead of stopping safely, there is a risk of rolling out of the lane. The weather in Turin also played against the crew. Low clouds and rain significantly reduced visibility. The dispatcher provided data according to which the conditions were considered difficult but acceptable. In reality, everything was worse. The horizon was covered with dense clouds, wet asphalt glistened on the runway, and ahead of the pilots there was not the usual alignment with the glide path light system, but an almost intuitive search for the beginning of the lane in a gray haze. Against this background, the cabin of the Ruslan lived its own life. There was a working atmosphere there, but there was already tension in the dialogue between the commanders and the co-pilot. On the one hand, there is confidence in the car, which has repeatedly coped with much more difficult tasks. On the other hand, there is an inner feeling of uncertainty. How will the giant behave in a short and wet lane? The contrast was striking. Outside the window there are clouds, a calm ride, and inside there are thoughts about the upcoming descent, about whether there will be enough distance if you have to land on a wet surface. All this still seemed to be just a theory, the usual job of a pilot. But it is this theory that will very soon turn into a harsh practice, where every word spoken in the cockpit will have a price. And when Italy appeared on the horizon, it seemed that there was only a calm completion of the first stage of the journey ahead. The crew did not know yet. The landing in Turin would be the beginning of a chain of decisions, each of which would further narrow the maneuver space. Turin Airport is the gateway to Italy's industrial region. In 1996, renovation work was actively carried out here. The main runway, the only one suitable for receiving heavy airliners, was partially closed. It was still listed on the diagram as 3,300 meters, but in fact the working length was only 2,350. For a modern medium-haul airliner like the Boeing 737 or Airbus A320, such a distance was enough with a margin. But for the An-124, even empty, the numbers looked alarming. Ruslan weighs more than 200 tons when touched. Its wheels, 24 points of contact with concrete, must absorb tremendous energy. And if there are not enough lanes, no brakes will help. The weather aggravated the picture. It was raining lightly on the approach to Turin, and the strip glistened with a wet film. In such conditions, the coefficient of adhesion of wheels to concrete drops sharply. So, to stop, you need even more distance. The crew knew about this, but hoped that there was still a reserve. On the ground, the controllers didn't play on the pilot's side either. The weather data was transmitted formally. Visibility was allegedly 1.5 kilometers, which was considered the acceptable minimum. But in fact, clouds and haze significantly reduced visibility. The runway could only be seen at a very low altitude, too late to calmly adjust the approach. Another problem was added to this. Due to repairs, the glide path system, which normally helps pilots accurately maintain the angle of descent, did not work. Without her, the crew was forced to rely on instruments and their own experience. And experience in such situations is an insidious thing. Sometimes it suggests the right decision, but sometimes confidence prevents you from recognizing the risk in time. This was how an invisible trap was formed. According to the documents, everything looked tolerable. The working length is there, the weather is within tolerance, entry is allowed. But in practice, every parameter was on edge. And together, These almost norms turned into conditions where the slightest mistake could become fatal. The situation was like a chess game, where the opponent makes simple and inconspicuous moves, but gradually drives the opponent into a corner. While the Ruslan was descending, its crew had not yet seen the whole picture. But every kilometer of the way brought them closer to the lane, which turned out to be shorter, slippery, and hidden by fog. The plane goes out onto the glide path. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere becomes denser than the air outside the windows. Ugryumov and Borodai see that the streak appears too late, as if it emerges from a gray haze at the last moment. Where they expected to see the familiar end, the Earth seemed to shift. Pilots understand that the working length is less than expected. For an empty Ruslan, this is a chance because the weight has been reduced and landing should be easier. But at the same time, a wet surface and a shortened section leave no room for inaccuracy. Ugryumov, the official commander, is the first to express doubts. His voice sounds strained. He insists on leaving for the second round. This decision seems logical. If in doubt, it is better to abort the approach, gain altitude, and repeat. But Borodai, the de facto commander, is also sitting in the cockpit, more confident in his abilities. He is convinced that landing is possible. We can handle it. There's enough distance. This is how the conflict of views begins. In real time, these are seconds, but for the viewer, they turn into a long, painful argument. One word, and the plane will either continue to descend or climb. At this moment, two worlds collide in the cockpit. One is caution, the idea that it is better to be safe. The other is experience, confidence, faith in one's own hands and in a car that has never failed. This is a classic pilot's dilemma. Trust the instrument information or rely on the feeling that control is in your hands. The view of the strip is becoming clearer. It is indeed shorter than expected, Ugryumov insists. His voice is getting tougher, as if he's trying to shout over not only the noise of the engines, but also his own doubts. Borodai reaches for the levers, but still holds the landing course. There is no more than a meter between the wheels and the surface. At such moments, the pilot feels almost physically how many meters to go, whether the brakes are enough, whether the reverse will hold. But an order sounds in the cockpit. Leave. The levers pull sharply forward, and the engines must respond with a powerful jerk. In theory, this is a chance to save the situation. But theory and practice rarely coincide when it comes to a multi-ton machine located a few dozen meters from the ground. The engine control levers move forward sharply. The pilots immediately switch them to the maximum takeoff mode. Logically, everything should have happened instantly. For D18T turbofan engines, huge cylinders made of titanium and steel should have come to life with a full roar and pulled the car up, as if grabbing it by the wings with their hand. But instead of the expected jerk, there is silence, or rather, the same hum at minimum thrust. The arrows of the indicators do not creep up, the revolutions do not grow. The An-124 does not seem to hear the commands of its pilots. This is where one of the most vulnerable features of this engine lies. Unlike many Western counterparts, the Soviet D-18T was capricious to sudden movements of levers. To convert it from low throttle to maximum thrust, it had to be done step by step, giving the system time to unwind. A sharp leap forward did not speed up the process, but, on the contrary, could drown out the automation. The engine seemed to hang on the old mode, waiting for the correct algorithm. They understand in the cockpit. A mistake. Borodai repeats the actions correctly, following the entire chain, as taught by the instructions. But time is running out. The speed decreases, the angle of attack increases, and the height is only a few tens of meters. 3 engines are still not responding to the command. Only one goes into takeoff mode, but this is catastrophically not enough to hold a multi-ton aircraft. A Colossus with a wingspan of 73 meters cannot be pulled with one thrust. The pilots repeat the procedure over and over again in desperation. In the cockpit, there are fragments of phrases, speed figures, commands. Mode. The speed is dropping, but each attempt ends in the same way. The engines remain at minimum thrust. The technique that was supposed to be an ally is turning into a silent enemy. The crew has only seconds left to change the outcome, but instead of the expected upward leap, the Ruslan continues to descend, like a giant that has lost its strength, moving by inertia towards the Earth. And now there's not an endless stretch of concrete ahead where you could still slow down. There are trees, houses, and people ahead who don't even know that a 200-ton steel mountain is slowly heading their way. The height was rapidly melting. The plane, which a minute ago was holding a glide path, was now flying too low and too slow. The huge An-124 was losing speed. Its nose was lifted up, but there was not enough strength to climb. From the outside, it looked as if the giant was trying to break free from invisible shackles, but the wings wouldn't obey. Under the fuselage, there are no longer concrete strips, but roofs of suburban houses. The residents of San Francisco El Campo could not even imagine that the trajectory of a car weighing more than 200 tons was passing over their heads. The engines are humming, but not pulling. The pilots continue to shout commands, trying to revive the equipment, but the aircraft obeys only the laws of aerodynamics. The speed decreases, the angle of attack increases, the resistance increases. The first impact hit the treetops. Branches snapped like matchsticks under the weight of aluminum and steel. Then the hull hit the roof of one of the houses. A moment later, a massive wing shears off the tiles, collapsing the beams. After that, the plane tilts, loses its remaining stability and, as if in slow motion, rushes down. The impact on the ground broke the silence of the suburban morning hour. The fuselage partially collapsed, the nose section with the cockpit literally disintegrated, and the left wing was blown to shreds. Flames leaped out of the rifts. Ruslan, a symbol of strength and reliability, has become a twisted wreckage among farm buildings. The huge transporter, designed to deliver tanks and missiles across continents, proved powerless in the face of a chain of human decisions and technical features. And if seconds decided everything in the cockpit, then everything happened suddenly on the ground. A farming family engaged in ordinary activities found themselves in the epicenter of the disaster. Their house was demolished by an airplane strike, leaving behind ruins and flames. The picture was reminiscent of a confrontation between titans and humans. A steel machine crashed into a quiet village where life flowed calmly and steadily. The contrast was almost painful. A moment ago, everything was as usual, and suddenly the sky collapsed over the roof. Inside the cabin, the impact energy was monstrous. The nose of the plane, where the pilots were sitting, took the brunt of the impact. Metal crumpled, structures flew apart, instrument panels turned into rubble. Those in front had no chance. Alexander Ugryamov, the official commander, and one of the replacement pilots, Oleg Pripuskov, died instantly. Alexei Borodai, who was flying the plane in those last minutes, miraculously survived, but was seriously injured. Doctors will later do everything possible to save him, but the price will be huge. He will lose both legs. For the crew of the Ruslan, this flight was a routine work task. But in 1 second, the work routine turned into a struggle for survival. 13 crew members were injured in various degrees of severity. And if before the disaster they were connected only by service, then after it they were all united by a common tragedy. But the drama wasn't limited to the cabin. On Earth, the consequences were no less severe. Farmer Foreign Martin and his wife Maria Peruca were at home at the time. Their household turned out to be right on the trajectory of a falling plane. The impact was so powerful that people didn't have a second to escape. Their house collapsed completely, turning into a pile of rubble. Several more local residents were injured. One of them later died in hospital, increasing the total death toll to 5 people. For the small town of San Francisco El Campo, this tragedy came as a shock. Rarely did anything out of the ordinary happen here. Life flowed smoothly, farm work, quiet evenings, family. And suddenly, the heavens brought down a multi-ton car on people. The contrast was unbearable. Where the bright red Ferraris, a symbol of wealth and beauty, should have been, instead there were ashes, ruins, and human pain. Instead of the gleam of lacquered hoods, there is twisted metal. Instead of the joy of cargo delivery, there is a list of injured and dead. This disaster has shown that even the most reliable systems, the most experienced crews, and the most powerful aircraft remain part of a world where the cost of error is measured in human lives. After the disaster, A commission of the Interstate Aviation Committee arrived in Italy. Work began immediately. The crash site was cordoned off, the wreckage was carefully photographed, and each fragment of the structure was marked on diagrams. There are no small details in such investigations. Even a small piece of metal can tell you exactly what happened in the last seconds. The first data has already been confirmed. The weather at the time of sunset was worse than reported to the crew. Visibility on the strip was no more than 1.5 kilometers. For a heavy transport vehicle, this is critically small. Pilots must see the runway in advance to assess whether there is enough distance to touch and brake. The next key factor was the length of the strip. Due to the repairs, the end of the runway was moved forward. The working part was reduced to 2,350 meters. This corresponded to the standards for light and medium-sized aircraft, but for Ruslan it was the maximum value, especially on wet surfaces. Moreover, the glide path system, which helps to enter exactly along the axis, did not work. It turned out that the crew actually landed almost blindly, relying only on instruments and their own experience. The commission also noted serious problems in the actions of the crew. Approach planning was not fully carried out, control maps were not worked out, and the distribution of duties in the cockpit was disrupted. The presence of two commanders played a cruel joke. Ugryamov, who was listed as the commander, actually gave up the role to Borodai, but at the same time, at a critical moment, he tried to seize the initiative. As a result, there was a belated decision to retire to the second round, and leaving turned out to be the most vulnerable point. Experts have analyzed the D-18T engine control system in detail. Their design required a careful and consistent increase in thrust. A sudden shift of the levers forward led to a delay. Sometimes the engine did not react at all without the correct sequence. This is exactly what happened on the Ruslan. Only one engine went into maximum mode. The other three remained at minimum thrust. The car was unable to gain speed and altitude. In fact, the crew found themselves in a situation they were not prepared for. The belated decision to go on the second lap led to the fact that the pilots had no height left to maneuver. Errors in the cabin, engine features, airport shortcomings, all this overlapped with each other. The final report of the commission looked cold and stern. It stated that the causes of the disaster were unsatisfactory weather conditions, a shortened runway, a malfunctioning approach system, crew errors in coordination and procedures, as well as design features of the power plant. But the dry lines of the report could not convey what happened in the cockpit and on the ground. It was a lesson for specialists, a tragedy for families, and a signal for aviation that even the largest and strongest machines have weaknesses. In aviation, the question always remains, what if? If Borodai had insisted on landing until the end, would the remaining distance have been enough? The empty Ruslan had a lower weight and therefore a lower mileage. Perhaps even the plane could stop on a shortened runway. Dangerous, risky, but still possible. If the decision to leave had been made a little earlier, even at altitude, when there was more maneuver space left before the lane, the engines would have had time to unwind. There would have been enough thrust to go into the set. The An-124 could rise into the clouds again, turn around and try again. If the Italian airport had met international standards and informed the crew in time about the actual length of the runway and weather conditions, the pilots would not have had the false feeling that everything was within the normal range. If the engine's design had allowed it to operate without delay with a sudden movement of the levers, the aircraft would have received thrust on time. 3 seconds and the outcome could have been completely different. Each of these ifs sounds like a life-saving option that was hanging somewhere nearby, but never became a reality. A chain of small factors has developed into one fatal scenario. For the viewer, it's like parallel universes. In one, the An-124 safely lands. In the other, it goes on a second lap and goes further into the sky. But in the only reality that happened, the car couldn't cover the last kilometers. In Brunei, in the distant Bandar Seri Begawan, they were preparing to receive an unusual cargo. Several Ferrari cars were supposed to arrive aboard the Soviet giant. To the customers, it looked almost theatrical. Luxurious red cars in the belly of a steel monster, driving down a ramp directly onto the sunny asphalt. The contrast of strength and beauty, speed and power. But that shot never happened. Instead of a bright picture, There was debris on the outskirts of a small Italian town. Instead of the gleam of lacquered bodies, there are ashes and ruins. The An-124 Ruslan, an aircraft designed to overcome distances and deliver the hardest things, turned out to be the victim of a combination of circumstances. Human doubts, technical peculiarities, inaccuracies in information. All this formed a chain that crossed out the fate of the flight. The greatness of aviation and its vulnerability manifested themselves here at the same time. In one shot, the power, the roar of engines, hundreds of tons of steel and titanium. In the other, there is silence, smoking debris, and figures in the commission's reports. The story of Ruslan, who did not return, reminds us that there are no small things in aviation. Every meter of the lane, every phrase of the dispatcher, every lever movement can be decisive. And the bigger the plane, the less room for error the people who operate it have. This disaster was a tragedy for the crew, for the residents of San Francesco El Campo, and for the entire aviation. But it also became a lesson written down in the regulations and in memory of those who took the helm after this incident. And when the An-124 rises in the sky again, the viewer sees not only its power and greatness, but also knows the price that had to be paid to keep such machines flying.